Hello, my name is John Secker and I'm going to talk to you tonight about growing rare arable plants in cultivated margins. I work on an arable farm on the western edge of Breckland on the southwest Northwest Suffolk county boundary. Breckland is an area of approximately 500 square miles where the soil type is mainly very light sand, underlain by a bedrock of chalk. The chalk outcrops on the western edge of Breckland, so our soil type on the farm is mainly chalky loam, which becomes sandier as the chalk dips beneath the sand to the east. The farm first went into a stewardship scheme in 2012, and one of the options chosen was cultivated margins and plots. Why cultivated margins? Arable plants are the fastest declining suite of plants in the UK today. Cultivation of land to grow crops has in the past encouraged their proliferation. However, with the advent of herbicides, which have become ever more efficient, and the use of artificial fertilisers, which result in arable weeds being outcompeted by vigorous crops, the seed bank is becoming extremely low. This has a detrimental effect on other wildlife. Many invertebrates depend on these plants as hosts and sources of nectar and pollen. Many species of farmland birds feed their chicks on these invertebrates and rely on the seed for food in the winter. To help redress the balance, cultivated margins or plots can be established on the farm as an option within a stewardship scheme. Margins are usually 6-metre strips around the edges of fields. The edge of the field is preferred as this is likely to be where the seed bank will be at its best, and likely to be the least productive and therefore least profitable part of the field to farm. Plots can be part of a field or possibly even a whole field. The aim is to encourage the growth of annual arable plants by disturbing the soil once a year at an appropriate time to encourage their germination. Cultivated margins work best on lighter soils where the fertility is lower. On these soils, any residual fertility from intensive farming soon begins to drop away, and for the same reason, cultivated margins are best suited to being non-rotational. It is important to stress that nothing is sown. You are totally reliant on the existing seed bank, which under the correct management will naturally build up over time. That build-up will never happen in a margin sown with perennial wildflowers because the perennials will just outcompete the annuals. So what are rare arable plants? Annual arable plants are just plants that need ground disturbance, creating bare ground, which allows them to germinate and develop without competition from the more vigorous perennials. Many of these plants are in fact non-natives, having been brought to these shores as man migrated across Europe from Asia, bringing with him farming, cultivation for crops, and therefore the weeds that went with the crops. Some of these plants we now regard as weeds were in fact originally grown for food. By definition, a weed is a plant growing where we humans don't want it. So in a cultivated margin where we are encouraging them to grow, annual plant is a more appropriate term. So management of cultivated margins is largely a question of timing and preparation method. With timing, the prescription given is to establish a fine, firm seed bed similar to one you would prepare for spring barley in late winter, early spring, February, March, or autumn, September, October, November. Being farmers, we thought the logical optimum time for preparation would be when the soil had warmed up in spring or before it cooled down in autumn. We very soon learned that it was not that simple. The margins prepared in spring were overrun with fat hen, almost smothering out everything else, partly because we were preparing the seed bed at an optimal time for fat hen to germinate, but also because fat hen prefers fertile conditions in which to grow, and fertility was still high following many years of intensive farming. Annual mercury and weed beat were also a problem. Autumn prepared margins were found to have some barren brome present, so we changed our establishment dates to early February or late October, and the result was quite dramatic. Species which we had never seen before or seen in very low numbers began to proliferate. Fat hen was now present at acceptable levels. It provides seeds for birds in winter and also, particularly in Breckland, is a food plant for the rare brush-thighed seed-eater beetle. Annual mercury, which is a very difficult weed to control in sugar beet, was also at acceptable levels. It is much favoured by linnets and greenfinches as a seed source. So there's two different methods of preparation that we can use. We can either plough or we can cultivate. Advice on how to prepare the seedbed was either to plough, which turns the soil over and buries the topsoil each year, or to cultivate, which merely disturbs the top layer. We opted to plough and harrow the soil down to a suitable tilth. This turned out to be far and away the best method. By inverting the soil every year, you are starting with a clean seedbed and burying any undesirable perennials. The perennials will eventually find a way through, but later than if they start the season sitting on the surface. Also, 90% of barren brome seed, if buried, will rot away. We have no problems with barren brome in ploughed margins, but it can totally dominate margins prepared by cultivation only. And if we look at the slides, we've got a margin that had been ploughed annually for 12 years. It's full of good plants, whereas the same margin in the right hand slide, after just 1 year of cultivation, is full of problem weeds, particularly mugwort, sterile brome and a few thistles. So we find the only effective way to deal with perennials is to spray with glyphosate. This is only necessary when perennials begin to dominate a margin. Spraying at the end of the growing season, by which time the annuals have set seed but the perennials are still in active growth, seems to work well. Late September seems to be an ideal time to spray. We would rather not use spray in a margin, but it seems to be the only way to control nuisance perennials. So, as I've already mentioned, cultivated margins work best in conditions of low fertility. So it is important to try to avoid applications of artificial fertilisers to neighbouring crops overlapping onto margins. As you can see in the pictures, overlap can result in vigorous growth of species which prefer high nutrient levels, such as fat hen, which will smother out everything else. Another problem weed on the farm was fiddleneck, an alien plant brought into the UK in the 1950s in carrot seed from North America. It can also dominate a margin and appears to have no benefits other than as a possible nectar source for some insects. We were ploughing the 6 metre margins and then harrowing with a 4 metre harrow, which meant the centre 2 metres was being covered twice. And we noticed that often the fiddleneck was only growing in the centre 2 metres where the seedbed was finer and more compacted. So we took the decision to use a 3 metre harrow, which didn't break the soil down so finely, nor overlap the centre 2 metres. And we found that the fiddleneck was almost totally eliminated on all but the sandiest of soils. On these margins, we found the only way to deal with fiddleneck was to plough and do no follow-up cultivations, so you've got a very loose seedbed. Where we did get a problem with fiddleneck, the only way we found to deal with that was to mow it, and we finished up with quite good results from that. So you can see on the slide that the fiddleneck has been replaced by a big population of field forget-me-not. So then we come to the best bit, the plants that benefit from these cultivated margins. Many of the margins on the farm have 50 to 60 different species of arable plants in them, and we have recorded around 100 different species of arable flowering plant on the farm, some of which are nationally scarce. Some of the more interesting are common fumitory, prickly poppy, rough poppy, night flowering catchfly, dwarf spurge, flicksweed, Venus's looking glass, and then we have 2 nationally scarce species, dense flowered fumitory and fine leaf fumitory, and a species of conservation concern, corn gromwell. So now every year the margins are full of ever-changing colour right from late March through to early October. We can see on the slide middle of April we've got a margin there full of common field speedwell, and then moving on to the next slide there's common fumitory there, and the yellow one is charlock, and the little blue ones in there are common field speedwell. And then by the middle of June, which is when the margins are really at their best, we've got that really diverse range of plants. So moving on to late June, in that margin, in that plot rather, you can see rough poppy, and then all the little bright ones around that rough poppy, prickly poppy, and in the background common poppy. And then in the a different margin at the same time, we've got white campion in there, bladder campion, and common poppy. And then mid-July, again a big change in the margin, we've got lots of scentless mayweed and common poppy. So we can see on this slide what a diverse range of species you can get in a very small area. This is just 1 square metre with 9 species in. So many invertebrates also benefit from the diverse range of plants in the margins. And whilst we would rather not use glyphosate to control perennials, spraying does not seem to be having a negative effect on invertebrates. The University of East Anglia ran some pitfall traps in the margins in 2023. The contents were identified by an experienced entomologist, and he described what he found as absolutely monumental. He also ran his own pitfall traps, and he said that he had never recorded so many species in one day anywhere ever. Across the Brecks as a whole, 328 species of invertebrates were recorded from samples from the margins, compared to only 67 species in cropped field samples. There were 2 county first records for beetles, a county second record for a beetle, and also a species of leafhopper only recently found new to the UK, making this only the 3rd site where it has been found. He also found flicksweed flea beetle, which is a red data book species only recorded in Breckland, and again only its 3rd known site in the UK. Another red data book species confined to the Breckland is grey carpet moth. Walking the margins around 2 fields at dusk, we found around 100 individuals. Many farmland bird species benefit from the abundance of invertebrates in cultivated margins to feed their chicks. For instance, corn bunting, yellowhammer, skylark and grey partridge. So one of the most rewarding aspects of having cultivated margins on the farm for me has been the return of turtle doves. Turtle doves were a very common bird on the farm during the 70s and 80s, but in common with much of the rest of the UK, a catastrophic decline in numbers resulted in no sightings for many years. That decline is partly driven by the lack of seed from annual arable plants, upon which turtle doves depend, but helped by supplementary feeding early in the season and foraging habitat in the cultivated margins, numbers of turtle doves began to build up again. It has been found that adult turtle doves can manage on supplied supplementary feed. However, to thrive, the fledglings need natural seed, such as that found in cultivated margins. Fumitory is often quoted as being a favourite of turtle doves, and that is indeed true. However, they will eat a wide variety of different seeds, including very common ones such as chickweed. So just because you don't have fumitory doesn't mean that you will not get turtle doves. A perfect margin for turtle doves to feed in is one with a wide variety of different arable plants providing the seed, and at least 30% bare ground, because turtle doves do not like feeding in dense, rank vegetation. So now we have a thriving population of turtle doves, and we have recorded up to 17 birds feeding together in a margin. This camera trap video enables us to see turtle doves using cultivated margins. They are feeding on fumitory, and you can see the bird in the foreground plucking semi-ripe seeds from the plants. But obviously margins aren't just used for foraging, because you can see in this clip a male displaying and chasing a female, calling as well. Yeah, so I'd just like to mention that the farm is a member of the Breckland Farmers Wildlife Network, a group of 60 farms managing around 55,000 hectares of land, and currently in the development phase of a landscape recovery project. One of the key aims of the group is to make the margins even more effective by creating a network right across Breckland, linking up individual farms, areas of grass heath and nature reserves. There are currently approximately 600 miles of cultivated margins in the Breckland area, plus plots and whole field options. So just to sum up, all in all, I think there is no better way to increase biodiversity on an arable farm than cultivated margins. Managed correctly, they benefit arable plants generally, and especially many rare plants, and therefore in turn invertebrates, farmland birds and mammals. So thanks for listening, and I just hope this may have encouraged landowners to take up cultivated margin options, or for those with cultivated margins, given some advice as to their management. Thank you.